Lead exposure is responsible for income loss equivalent to like 6 to 8% of GDP every single year. There's a massive burden of disease. That's what we're trying to address.
G'day folks, and welcome back to the Giving What We Can podcast, where we combine compassion with critical thinking as we explore how to use our resources to do the most good. I'm your host, Luke Freeman, and today I'm joined by Lucia Coulter, who is a doctor turned charity founder. Lucia recently co-founded the Lead Exposure Elimination Project, otherwise known as LEEP. LEEP works to eliminate lead poisoning worldwide by advocating for the regulation of lead paint. Lucia is also a member of the Giving What We Can community, where she used to be the co-president of our Cambridge chapter. So without further ado, here's Lucia. Lucia, welcome and thank you for joining me today. First up, I'd love it if you could tell me about the Lead Exposure Elimination Project.
Thanks for having me, Luke. It's really great. So basically, what we are trying to do is reduce childhood lead poisoning in low and middle income countries. And childhood lead poisoning is this really neglected but huge scale problem. It affects around 1 in 3 kids. It affects children's developing brains and is a neurotoxin. So it causes neurodevelopmental problems like reduced intelligence, behavioral problems, reduced educational attainment, and reduced future income later in life as well. And then it also has these physical health problems. So it causes cardiovascular disease, it causes kidney disease, anemia, growth stunting, all of these impacts which are spread across this really huge number of children, around over 800 million children worldwide. And in some countries, it's even thought that lead exposure is responsible for income loss equivalent to like 6 to 8% of GDP every single year. There's a massive burden of disease. I think 1% of the burden of disease at least. And yeah, that's what we're trying to address.
Wow, that's incredible. So can you tell me more about what LEEP does to reduce lead exposure?
Yeah, so at the moment, we're focusing on lead exposure from paint. We think it's a really important source of lead exposure, and we also think it has the strongest evidence base for being tractable to address. So lead in paint has been banned in high-income countries like UK, Australia, US for 50 years or so. But in a lot of low-income countries, it's still being used in really huge amounts. In many countries, populations are growing quickly, urbanization is growing quickly, and so paint markets are growing, and more lead is being added into the environment. It's being put on homes, being put in schools, and over time, the lead in paint on walls forms dust and flakes, and then children get it in their mouths, and that's what causes lead poisoning in childhood. But in terms of like what we actually do, so firstly, we identify countries where we think that there's a lot of lead in paint. And then we go to these countries, or we work with partners in these countries to carry out paint sampling studies, where we basically go and buy a load of paint, do a bit of market analysis, and analyze it for lead content. And it's pretty crazy because this data just doesn't exist already. Like, people really don't know, is there lead in paint in a lot of countries? So we find out, and then we share the information with the health ministries, the regulatory authorities, other important stakeholders, and we say, this is a big problem. We raise awareness about the impact of childhood lead poisoning. We show them that there's a lot of lead in the paint. And then we explain the solution, which is basically effective regulation of lead in paint, basically banning it for household use at least, hopefully more broadly. And then we support them in introducing or enforcing regulation. Sometimes they might already have regulation that's just not being enforced, or they might not have any. So we can bring together stakeholders, we can provide technical advice and that sort of thing. And then the other part of it is we also work with the paint manufacturers themselves, so we can offer them technical advice to help them switch to lead-free and access non-lead ingredients and that sort of thing. So we hope that basically with that enforcement of lead paint regulation plus the support with reformulation, then there'll be less lead paint on the market, less lead paint use, less childhood lead exposure, and that will have an impact on children's health and well-being and future potential and all of that.
Yeah, that's great. I guess this is another example of problems that we don't recognize because they don't exist anymore in high-income countries. You kind of assume that this is the case everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. I think another reason why it's neglected is obviously partly this. It doesn't exist in wealthy and powerful countries so much anymore, or it does, but like kind of legacy problems, so like old lead paint on walls or old lead in pipes. So it's not affecting the most kind of wealthy and powerful people in the world. But then I also think there's just the fact that it's such an invisible problem. like even compared to like, traditionally neglected tropical diseases like infectious disease, like malaria or whatever. I think lead is again different because although it's affecting 1 in 3 kids, you wouldn't know it because the effects that it has, these kind of neurodevelopmental problems, these health problems later in life, they're not things that you'll see someone suffering from and know that it's a result of lead exposure. Whereas like, with malaria, you'll be having cyclical fevers. With TB, you'll be having, cough and weight loss or whatever, but with lead exposure, it's not obvious. And so it doesn't seem like a priority problem to address or to research.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that a lot of crime reduction in some high-income countries was, 15 years following the removal of lead that was causing childhood development problems. Yeah,
there are these absolutely fascinating correlations between reductions in environmental lead and reductions in crime. And it's a trend that's seen in different countries and like in different periods of time. So it seems that it could actually be having this societal impact as well of crime reduction when you reduce lead exposure. I'd say that the evidence for that is all is weaker than the evidence for the other impacts of lead exposure, but it still seems to be quite fairly compelling and super interesting as well.
Yeah, just these kind of long run effects that if you're interacting with development.
Yeah, exactly. And recently there was a study that came out showing the impact of lead on personality traits as well over a lifetime. So there's some evidence that it reduces conscientiousness and agreeableness, increases neuroticism and that sort of thing. Which obviously at a population level, when so many people are exposed, you can imagine that having really significant societal impacts. So, so far we have carried out a paint sampling study, that showed that paint in Malawi, solvent-based paint in Malawi contains really high levels of lead. And we shared those findings with the, Malawi Ministry of Health and the Malawi Bureau of Standards and raised awareness with them about the impact of childhood lead exposure. And then as a result of our meetings with them and sharing that data, they've started actually implementing lead paint regulation. They've started monitoring paint for lead content, and they're updating their paint standard to be in line with the WHO recommended limit for lead content. And we're also working with manufacturers there to help them overcome any barriers to switching to lead-free. So that's pretty cool because we've been going just for a few months. We haven't even been around for a year yet, and we've already had this progress in Malawi getting lead paint regulation implemented. And we've also run a paint study now in Botswana, and we actually found that the paint on the market in Botswana is pretty much almost all imported from South Africa, and South Africa does have lead paint regulation, so we didn't find high levels of lead there. And we're now also in the process of running these paint studies in Zimbabwe and Madagascar as well. So yeah, that's what we've been up to.
That's great. Yeah, I imagine regulation is quite sticky of a solution, especially when you get the manufacturers on board. Does LEEP have plans to monitor and evaluate the continued success after the initial intervention?
Yeah, I think definitely that's a priority of ours, because we need to know if it's actually reducing the amount of lead paint on the market, which is what we care about. A good indicator for what we care about, which is actually childhood lead poisoning. So yeah, we'll be carrying out regular follow-up studies in all the countries where we run this intervention. This will tell us if the enforcement's working, and it will also kind of keep the pressure on, keep the momentum going for enforcement and compliance as well. The Malawi Bureau of Standards reckon that will be quite helpful because the sampling they do, the monitoring they do is like they go to the manufacturers and they do sampling audits, whereas we do market sampling. So it's kind of complementary as well to their monitoring. And then if the compliance isn't increasing as quickly as we expect, we can do other things as well. So we could, for example, increase the pressure a bit through like public and media involvement and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And so you've got a couple of studies so far. You've got your first intervention working with government and manufacturers. What are the plans to scale up from here?
So the plan for year 2, which is beginning next month, is to expand our operations. So we would ideally like to carry out these paint sampling studies in 8 more countries, and then get started with the kind of advocacy and industry outreach in those where we do find high levels of lead in paint, which will probably be the majority of those countries. So we'll be expanding our team. And yeah, I mean, there are still over 76 countries with no lead paint regulation. And even more which have regulation that's probably not being enforced. And so the more quickly we can work in as many countries as possible, the more quickly the amount of lead paint being used can be reduced. And as I mentioned before, the use of lead paint is increasing quickly because of this population growth and urbanization. And all of that lead paint going into the environment is going to be there for years and years to come. So if we can replace that with safer paint as soon as possible, then our impact can be a lot bigger.
Yeah, that's amazing. Have you learned anything along the way as to why this hasn't been a priority earlier?
I mean, in Malawi, it just wasn't known to be a problem. There was no data to show that there was lead in paint. The relevant stakeholders didn't know that lead in paint was a problem. I think there was kind of probably some impression that lead in paint was an outdated technology that had kind of naturally been phased out over time. And so, just wasn't known to be a problem to address, which is pretty wild.
That is. Yeah. I think it's pretty fascinating. In Flint, Michigan, in the US, there was a lot of awareness around the lead problems they were having there. Again, that was pipes and their water supply. But you think that would have been a trigger for a lot of places to start to think about, what is our environmental lead exposure? Yeah,
and another interesting thing is that there are even more sources that could be as important as paint and could also be trackable to address that are problems in low-income countries that we don't know about because they just haven't been studied yet. One that we'd like to investigate a bit more is lead in spices. I don't know if you've heard about this, but there was a study in Bangladesh recently that showed that a lot of turmeric has really high concentrations of lead. And that's because, the producers add yellow lead pigment to the turmeric root to make it a more appetizing color. Because I think it can turn out a bit pale depending on the conditions that it's produced in. So they add this lead pigment, which, really high levels of lead in a food which you're directly putting into your mouth. So that's a problem in some places in Bangladesh. It's been shown to be a problem in Georgia as well, the country, and probably is relatively widespread. So we could start doing some sampling of spices as well, and then see if we can apply a similar intervention to what we're doing with paint. But there are probably more sources and huge amounts of research yet to be done.
It's actually surprisingly transferable, the sampling and then working with regulators and manufacturers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So,
looking forward, what do you see as the biggest risks to LEEP's work?
So there are a couple of things that we've been thinking about a lot recently. I mean, one is that progress could slow down in Malawi. It could take longer than we hope to actually reach the point of having less lead paint on the market. Like, for example, if government or industry stop engaging or stop prioritizing it. So far, engagement's been really good and the momentum's been really good, but that could slow down for a number of reasons, like, COVID or just other stuff happening. There's huge numbers of priorities for these people. So, but there are things we can do if that happens, like we can start increasing the pressure through public and media and that sort of thing, working out what other barriers there might be. Another risk and uncertainty is the extent to which our progress in Malawi is replicable in other countries. We'll be able to get a better sense of that over the next year as we continue work in Zimbabwe and Madagascar and as we expand to other target countries as well. But it's hard to say at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. So before we move on to some other questions around charity entrepreneurship and how you got to where you are, I'd love to know how you recommend people support LEEP.
So what you can do if you're interested in what we're up to, you can sign up to our newsletter on our website, leadelimination.org, and we can keep you updated with study results that we're doing and everything else that's going on. We are fundraising at the moment as well. So if you're interested in donating to a project like LEEP, early stage charity working on lead exposure, then again, on our website, leadelimination.org, you can donate. Also, if you are interested in seeing if there are kind of volunteering or internship opportunities, we sometimes have some of those things that come up, projects. So you can email us. You can email me. My email is lucia@leadelimination.org. If anyone has any kind of expertise or advice, we're always looking for feedback. We're always looking for advice. Let us know.
Excellent. I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience of going through charity entrepreneurship.
Yeah, that was a great experience. It was really, really brilliant. I went through the program in summer last year. I think without that, I wouldn't have had the confidence or support to start a charity at this point in my career. And if I did, it probably would have also just had a lot of a lower chance of making quick progress or being high impact, cost effective. So really brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah. And can you tell me a little bit more about what Charity Entrepreneurship did to help Lead get started and to support throughout the process?
Yeah. So the first thing is this kind of 2-month incubation program. And that happened last summer. It was actually remote because of COVID, but it was still, it was pretty great. And that was where I decided to work on this intervention. They had done research throughout the previous year, looking at what charity ideas to recommend. And one of them was advocating for lead paint regulations. That was where we chose this intervention. It's also where I paired up with my co-founder, who was also on the program, Jack Rafferty. And it's also where we got our initial seed grant. And basically what they do during the program, as well as kind of setting you up with all of this stuff, is they teach you just a huge amount of like really practical and relevant content, about how to start a charity. So, how to make a cost effectiveness analysis, how to plan monitoring and evaluation strategy, how to hire, how to, make a 6-month plan, all of that kind of stuff. Highly recommend for anyone remotely interested. And I think a lot more people should consider, because I never really considered it, until I saw someone else do a similar thing. And then I was like, oh, that's a career option. That's a high impact thing I could actually probably do. And the other thing they do is they give, ongoing support. So almost a year in, we still have weekly mentoring with the Charity Entrepreneurship team. And then there's this whole community of, other previous incubatees who've also started charities that we get support from. It's really fun and satisfying to be learning a lot really quickly. And it's also just really fulfilling to actually be doing something that has a high chance of being impactful, or relatively high chance of being impactful and making a difference. So that's really great. There are things about it that are a lot more stressful than even working as a junior doctor during a pandemic. Like the kind of the uncertainty, you never really know if you're doing the right thing. There's it's very high stakes. Like you really want to get it right, and it's all on you and your co-founder. But yeah, that's, I think, just part of doing something with high expected value. It's risky, but potentially really good. So it's been a really good experience, overall.
I'd be interested in hearing how you found the transition from kind of your medical work to being in a charity and doing something quite different.
Yeah, it was a big shift. I think, it's like one of the main differences is, going from like playing a role in a system and knowing exactly what you're supposed to do to kind of working out from more first principles, like actually, what should I be doing? How do I prioritize things? That's quite a transition. But it's also just a really fun one, because it's part of being able to create something and then see things different from how they would be if you weren't doing the thing. Whereas when you're part of a health system and you're working as a doctor, the most you can do is make sure things go how they're supposed to go. Whereas when you're starting something new, they're going in a way where they wouldn't have otherwise gone, like the counterfactual impact thing, I suppose. I think the charity entrepreneurship support has been made a huge difference in making that transition easier as well, because we have these mentors and people who've been through the early stages of a charity startup themselves and can give that guidance and understanding of what it's all like, and the support as well. So that's been good. I do miss medicine. I do miss clinical medicine a bit. But I can still do some. So I did a shift last week, in the emergency department just to be just kind of for fun. So that's nice. So it's not been too
for fun. You do a shift of medical work in the emergency room.
But yeah, I think that makes the shift easier, because the other part of the shift is like an identity shift, right? Like being a doctor is like a super well-defined identity. Everyone understands, and it's like well respected. And then all of a sudden you're just doing something quite weird that a lot of people don't really get. And that can be hard, and it can be hard to, it's just something difficult about that. So, that's a bit of an adjustment as well, but it's all good. And, you know, I'm still a doctor. I can still practice medicine a bit and that kind of thing, which makes it easier.
Yeah. Are you glad that you spent the, you know, not an insignificant amount of time in that training to have that kind of both as kind of foundational work as well as, you know, a fallback and various other kind of benefits?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know whether, like, if I could go back again, I would have chosen to study medicine and practice as a doctor, but I definitely do feel that there are benefits from it. So like you say, the kind of the fallback option is really nice. It's a nice piece of security when I'm taking quite a risky career decision. It's nice to know that, oh, you know, I can always do that. The other thing is, I think studying medicine and practicing as a doctor gave me more kind of confidence in myself and my own abilities. Like I can do stuff. And that's quite empowering and made me feel, again, more confident to do something a bit more risky. The other thing that I'm grateful for from medicine is like the credibility that it gives you of being a doctor when you're working with, you know, health ministries or partners in other countries who are also doctors. It does help. So that's pretty cool. And then, you know, you learn relevant stuff about health systems and healthcare and people. You learn a lot about communication and decision making and all of these things that are pretty cross applicable as well. So I feel glad that I did it, but I'm not saying that it was that it wouldn't have been better not to do something else, like maybe a more direct route into something impactful. Yeah.
That being said, it's hard to have a direct route into what you're doing right now.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And I'm sure it helps in evaluating, you know, the work that you're doing as well. You know, having at least that, you know, foundational literacy in the medical side of things as well.
Yeah, and the research literacy as well. Like part of my degree, and I've done a lot of like research and that sort of thing, and that's pretty helpful. Yeah,
that's great. I'd like to wind back the clock a little bit and you know, tell us a little bit more about how you first encountered these ideas and kind of the spark of what inspired you to try and use your time and money and resources to do good in the world.
I was probably around 8 years old, and one of my school friends, actually, he died of leukemia. And I just remember thinking a lot about, you know, how this is a really bad thing. Like, this is really sad for, like, you know, his family and his friends. Thought a lot about, like, you know, the impact that has on his, like, mom and his little brother. And I remember, like, just being in my bedroom and, like, looking around at my stuff and being like, I would literally give away all of my toys, all of my clothes, everything to change that outcome. And of course, you know, you can't do that. But it got me thinking, like, there are actually things you can do to prevent people from dying. And I was aware that, you know, people in other contexts kids are dying for preventable reasons. And I started kind of feeling very uncomfortable with this idea that we would do so much for the people who are close to us, the people who we see and care about. And yet we don't really apply that to people further away and people who other people care about just as much, other people's friends. So I think that's when I kind of first started reflecting on that not being quite right. And I don't know if I really kind of like formulated exactly what that meant for how I wanted to live my life, but definitely kind of had this growing unease with like the norm of just focusing on the people around you and not thinking about the impact you can have on others as well. So I think that was probably the first thing. And then when I was around 12 years old, I went on a camping holiday with my grandpa, and I decided to bring a couple books. I've never really been a big reader, but I was like, you know, I'll read. It's a thing people do on holiday. And I took Twilight, highly recommend. And I also took this collection of essays by Peter Singer that I just found on the bookshelf at home. It's called Writings on an Ethical Life. I don't think it's still in print, but yeah. And one night I was reading Famine, Affluence and Morality. And I know you're familiar with this, but basically the conclusion Singer has is like, if it's within our power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing something of equal moral significance, then we ought to morally do it. And it doesn't matter if that person is like a neighbor's child or if it's someone like 10,000 miles away. And yeah, that essay had just a huge impact on me. Like, I remember just having this like very like strong and overwhelming mix of emotions. Like one of the emotions was like validation, like, and relief. Like, okay, I've been thinking this is a problem for a while. I've been thinking this seems like the correct conclusion, but like, here is a legitimate philosopher in a book saying what I thought was probably true, but you know, I'd always doubted because that's not how other people in my life seem to live their life or seem to agree with. So that was pretty cool. And then I guess the other emotion with that was like, oh no, like if this is really true, then this has like huge implications for how we should prioritize things in our lives, and has massive implications for how I should live my life going forward. So yeah, that was big. And I think that kind of made it all a lot more concrete for me. Like, yeah, this makes sense. Other people think so too. Let's do something about it.
Yeah. And at this stage in your life, did you know anyone else who thought similarly?
No, just Peter Singer. I became his biggest fan. I didn't really know anyone else. I started talking about it with more people after this. And yeah, started to find people who agreed. So that was cool. And then when I was in high school, I heard about Giving What We Can. And that was really awesome. And I was like, yes, this is clearly a good idea. This Giving What We Can pledge. I'm definitely going to take that when I'm old enough. And that was nice to know that there's this community out there of other people thinking the same way. And then when I got to university, I went to Cambridge where there was already an effective altruism chapter. And so I got involved there, and that was brilliant. And then in my third year, I co-ran Giving What We Can. And again, just uphill from there. I spent a whole 6 years at university doing medicine. And I think even out of all of that, it was the best part. And part of that is just like, you get to meet other people who are already really engaged in these ideas, and other people who've like thought about the same things as you. And you get to discuss with them and learn from them. And that's really awesome. And I think I'm still friends with a load of people from the chapter back then. And still having those people to learn from, discuss things with, you know, just like generally be inspired by is like really, really helpful. And yeah, just nice, even if not helpful, it's just great. I think it also made me personally feel more motivated. When you're doing something with other people, it's just more motivating. So it help you take like more concrete actions as well. So, taking the Giving What We Can pledge, becoming vegan, making career decisions, all of those like actual important steps are just way easier when you have other people around you doing the same thing or kind of validating that that's a reasonable decision. And then the other thing, I guess, is it opens up a lot of opportunities as well. So, you know, you meet other people going in the same direction as you, with the same values, and then you can work with them later. You can volunteer with them. You can get involved in other projects and organizations, and that's really cool. So yeah, highly recommend the whole kind of getting involved in the community, thing. Really good. And then in terms of like talking to other people about effective altruism and the pledge and that sort of thing, I think it's kind of the way it usually seems to go is like people already often kind of have these ideas and kind of agree, and then they just haven't found that this is a thing. And so that's really awesome to be there when people find out that this is a thing that they like really matters to them, and that there are other people, and you can kind of be part of that journey of like moving forward with taking those kind of core values and beliefs that people have and actually helping them like fulfill those and make it part of their life. So that's really nice. Yeah.
We're going to finish up shortly, but I thought I would ask, what are you most excited about on the plans for LEEP and also personally in the next kind of 12 months?
So I'm very excited about expanding LEEP. I'm excited to try and like multiply our impact to new countries. And yeah, looking at how many children we can impact, how many dallies we can avert. Sounds lame, but like that's very exciting for me. And I'm excited about expanding our team. That would be really cool. And also it's exciting to just be able to be part of like more engaged in the community and kind of talk to more people about these kinds of options, and even about like lead exposure and other neglected things, and have that kind of influence on other people as well is really cool.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I want to say thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was really great hearing some of the nuts and bolts around LEEP as well, being a little bit looking at things from afar and appreciating the work that you're doing, and really great to hear some of the details. So that's really fantastic. It was also really interesting hearing a bit about your story, including some of the younger years as well, which I personally empathize with a lot, that things can start pretty early, and it's really interesting to hear the path you took. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, really good to chat.
Thanks so much for lending me your ears for the duration of this episode. I hope you learned as much as I did. The full transcript of this interview is linked in the show notes, and we'll be posting highlights on YouTube. In our next episode, the tables will be turned as I'm interviewed by Joshua Ross from Humanitix. In the meantime, check out givingwhatwecan.org to learn more about effective giving and to join our community. Also check out effectivealtruism.org to learn more about different ways of using your resources to effectively help others. Until next time, keep on doing good.